In this screencast video, I want to show you how to use the Explorer tool and the Passage Guide to find instances where the New Testament quotes or alludes to the Old Testament. In the previous lesson, Dr. Oliphant discussed how Peter takes a passage from Isaiah 8 to encourage Christians in the midst of persecution and suffering. And in adapting this quotation, Peter equates Jesus with Yahweh from Isaiah 8. So in this screencast, I want to show you two different ways that you can use Logos to catch these types of Old Testament allusions that are found frequently in the New Testament. First, open up the Passage Guide from the Guides menu. Next, type in 1 Peter 3:14 in the reference box. Once the report is done generating, open up the Parallel Passages section. The first section you see here is a compilation from the resource titled Old Testament Quotations and Allusions in the New Testament by David Jones. For verses that are quoted or alluded to in the New Testament, it lists the Old Testament verse on the far left in canonical order. Then, on the right, it lists the New Testament passages that quote it. In our particular passage, there is only one quotation, which is from Isaiah. But in some verses, and especially if you run a passage guide on multiple verses, you will see this chart expanded to include a list of many Old Testament references. Hover over any of these references, and the verse will display from your default translation, called your favorite translation, in the Logos settings menu. This makes it very easy to have your New Testament passage open in one panel, and then hover over the Old Testament reference in the passage guide to easily spot the allusions. Click on the hyperlinked reference to 1 Peter 3:14 and 15 to open that passage up in your default translation. So here, the phrase, "Have no fear of them, nor be troubled," in 1 Peter 3:13, is connected to the phrase, "Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread," in Isaiah 8:12. And the phrase, "Honor Christ the Lord as holy," in 1 Peter 3:15, is connected to the phrase, "But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy," in Isaiah 8:13. As Dr. Oliphant pointed out, Peter replaced the name Yahweh, represented in the English translation as all capital Lord. Peter replaced it with Christ. One important aspect of studying Old Testament allusions is not just to see what was quoted, but to recognize how the New Testament writer adapted or changed the quotation. This can often have a great bearing on New Testament theology and practice for the church. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of Old Testament quotations and allusions in the New Testament, and it's very easy to miss some of them. And most of us don't have time to run a passage guide on every single passage we read in order to find these allusions. So let me show you how the Explorer tool can quickly show you Old Testament references on any passage that you happen to be reading through. First, open up the Tools menu and select Explorer. It opens up a slim side pane for you. By default, this is going to provide information on any passage that you're viewing in an active pane. It will jump to 1 Peter 3:14 automatically, since that is the passage we're already open to. Now, open up the Cross References tab. The other passages may have a related theme that can shed further light on a topic, but they're not direct allusions or quotations. So we see Isaiah 8:12-13 as expected. I also want to quickly show you how the Explorer tool follows whatever passage you're reading. As I scroll through 1 Peter, the cross-reference section continually updates for whichever passage I am now reading. So the Explorer tool can be very helpful as you're just reading along through the Bible and showing you connections you may not have ever noticed before. It saves you from needing to run a passage guide for every verse you're interested in seeing allusions in. And the Parallel Passages section of the Passage Guide is a great way to see the strongest and most relevant Old Testament quotations in the New Testament.